that you don't know, there's a full week of events about this party. Check them out. There's some postcards and QR codes and things to see things. Otherwise, now we haven't yet. But after now, treat yourself to a coffee. Treat yourself to a coffee or treat if you haven't. Appreciate you all.
All right. Good. All right. Hi everyone. I'm Daniel White. Hi everyone. I'm Daniel White. I am a pastor here in Ann Arbor. I'm a software organizer and I am planning Lisa and I serve on lovely panel. I'm going to ask the panelists. To answer themselves and answering those questions there. And I thought it might be nice. To start. I have a bunch of questions which I sent to them. I have a bunch of questions which I sent to them. So I didn't move questions around. But here's the way, which is what are the barriers to that may currently be opaque to the community that influences the types of developments that we see in the city? So whoever wants to start off, go there, and then you have 2 mics down there.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Hall. I'm the director of the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, and I have the distinct pleasure of being both a city employee and a developer, and having to go through the exact same processes that any other developer goes through. City staff do not give us any concessions. They treat us like everyone else, in case you've been wondering about that. It should be worse apparently. Some of the difficulties it's hard to see are costs, availability, cost of capital, where capital comes from. The people have heard about the cost of construction and post-COVID, the lack of people who are in the trades that can do the work, which is also driving up costs. And then of course we have city codes that also drive up costs and city fees. So that's in a big nutshell. We, especially if you're in a very constrained downtown site, you often have competing department codes and requirements that make it very difficult and challenging to build housing.
Hi, I'm feeling hurried because she's late. Hi, I'm Derek Delacorte. I'm a community services administrator. Right, this is where we are. Yeah, I've been working in planning and zoning in different communities. I started off as a transportation planner at SEMCOG, 25 years ago, doing intermodal transportation planning. Kurt's making an ear face. So, yeah, there we go. Okay. Started off doing intermodal transportation planning years ago, and that evolved into local community planning, economic development, and then it's evolved through different communities in Southeast Michigan over the years. Housing, for the last 15 years, the most opaque barrier, I think the one that is always unseen and rarely discussed. I think Jen hit on it. Starts with land value. It is so often the driver of the equation is what the cost of land is in a community. Every developer is interested in building a project in a city starts with that equation. When you add on construction costs, you add on regulatory frameworks and costs. Oftentimes communities, in their efforts to do everything the best possible, and Ann Arbor certainly has that desire, creates regulatory structure based on best practice in every individual discipline. That can create a regulatory structure that is difficult to maneuver through the intent of the community to make sure it has the highest quality development. And oftentimes it's the unintentional consequences surrounding those when you combine them all. I'm going to try to be brief here, but when you combine them all, that creates the greatest barrier to entry, I think, sometimes to land development, especially in a desirable community that has development and best practice. So I'll stop there. Just the question.
I love this question. I'm so sorry I'm late. I'm Shanna Morgan. I'm managing partner of Runaway Development. We're a woman-owned social impact development company that focuses on transformational projects that serve a deep community need. I have been in housing for 27 years. I've completed 20,000 units of housing throughout the country. My partner and I started our company to be very intentional about the type of projects that we deliver. I think, the problem with housing and barriers is that you really need to think of it as a highly complex jigsaw puzzle. And it takes many different pieces to put that puzzle together, especially if you're intentional in the drivers. Every piece of that puzzle has different requirements, has different regulatory requirements, different funding mechanisms to make it work. And sometimes with the best of intentions, we create barriers to that, we can't make that puzzle piece fit. I think, we're going to discuss more of the whys and, the choices that we make, but I think we need to be intentional about making sure we know what the puzzle pieces are.
Hi, everybody. My name is Missy Stoltz, and I'm the Sustainability and Innovations Director for the City of Ann Arbor. My background is working with local and indigenous populations to achieve their climate and equity goals. I am probably the least qualified to talk about development, just full transparency. You want to talk about climate change, I got you. But you want to talk about development, I play in the landscape of thinking certainly about what we develop and how we develop, but how we operate that space and how we create spaces that are safe, clean, and healthy for people and for our planet simultaneously. So I often am one who is viewed as someone adding cost onto that system, and yet I would argue that if we do not think about and integrate sustainability principles, I have a lot of questions about what we're doing in the future of where we're headed. So we try to work in collaboration across this table to figure out how we move our mutually reinforcing goals forward in a just and equitable way.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Raymond Hess. I'm the transportation manager for the city. Been in the space of municipal planning for 20 plus years across multiple states. Been in the city for about 5. As transportation manager, I too will try not to, surmise what all the housing challenges are, but I definitely want to highlight sort of that land use transportation connection, right? So land use, housing costs and transportation costs tend to represent some of the biggest outlays for any given household. And so really trying to figure out how we can give households transportation options, whether that be through transit, biking, walking, and giving people less costly transportation options to get around the community is something that we work for. But a lot of times that cost then translates over to the development side as well. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out, for example, the sidewalk space when we do review private development. And sometimes that will eat into the building footprint, which obviously can cost a developer funding. But we really want to preserve that pedestrian realm, that pedestrian space for mobility, for placemaking, and just for the community vitality as well. And so we're really trying to work hard with developers and in partnership with them to come up with mutually beneficial solutions.
Great. Next question. And any of the panelists can answer. You don't all have to answer every question, just so that you know. So if you have demographics you want to serve today, by all means. Are there things that are not in our plans, either our A20 plan, our comprehensive land use plan, our transportation plan, that you think should be, based on what you're seeing in other communities, in order for us in Ann Arbor to get more housing built, using less carbon, that is more equitable, that activates safe streets?
Yeah, I'll start with this one. That when we actually wrote A20, one of the actions, we have 7 strategies and 44 actions. One of the actions that did not make it in, but it made it through the whole planning process and then got cut as we got to the final end, working with City Council, was by right, in any neighborhood you could build duplexes, triplexes, and quads. And it got cut because it was too contentious, and that was sort of the compromise that was made around the political conversation that was taking place. And I think we're back to having that conversation right now. So Derek, to you.
I have always been, and I don't think this is a secret, I think it's about 75% of all zoned land in almost across the country is zoned for single family zoning. That is massive amounts of land dedicated to almost one singular use. I am not arguing the right or wrong of it at the times. We know the historical implications and impacts of that, how it was done. But what I do know, it is become in most communities a necessity in a shortage of housing to look at what can be done to change that. I hear the term, the elimination of single family zoning thrown around. I find that to be odd. Nobody's eliminating the ability for someone to build a single family home. But the impediment to building something other than a single family home in all of those neighborhoods, on all of that land across the country is, I think, a need to have a conversation about. I think the plan needs to be clear and specify the how-tos of it. I also want to be clear that planning something doesn't change a damn thing, that until you codify that in ordinance, all it is a recommendation. You can't do anything until you actually get through the planning process. The difficulty is the how of the codification. And I cannot emphasize that enough. It is clear the direction we've been given as part of our comprehensive plan that the council has directed us to come back with methods of how, not if we should make these changes. So for us in this community, regardless of what's in all the plans, I think council has asked us to come back with recommendations on how to reevaluate that significant chunk of land. So for me and for the next 18 plus months dealing with the comp plan, we are going to be looking at the evaluation of how and what recommendations to make to council. The hard part will be after the hows are recommended, the actual codification. And I'll stop. What do you got? There you
I
go.
would love to give the developer's perspective. I agree with you, Derek. You know, number one, we never walk into a municipality that has a perfect plan. It's really about partnership, collaboration, and the willing of our municipals to work with us to identify the needs of the local community, you know, to look and see what the process is, if there's a distinct process that we can get through plan review, where there's an opportunity for PUD. I wear a couple other hats besides developer. I serve on the National Steering Committee for Smart Growth America, you know, once again, working with Transportation for America, Form-Based Code. It's really hard to have the perfect plan. I think, you know, we go to a lot of communities that expect things to be perfect on paper, but the reality is development doesn't work that way. So what's important is the collaboration. It's about, you know, not keeping the developer in a silo and being able to communicate effectively strategy. Obviously, we need to make sure that there's a planning process that is streamlined, that we can see a way through that is not extremely costly with a lot of red tape. So, you know, making sure that that master plan is as effective as possible. There's several other things we have to keep in mind right now when we're working on master plans. We had 7 new pieces of legislation in the last 8 months in the state of Michigan related to housing and community development. We have, you know, 5 or 6 new funding mechanisms with new underwriting guidelines. And what's important is the willingness of the municipal to adapt. I think as a developer, the other thing we look at is what's your public process? How do your local officials respond to their public constituents?
Great, thank you. Next question. Residents often cite the lack of affordability as a reason to oppose new developments, especially during public comments, either at Planning Commission or at City Council. What would you like residents to understand about the affordability problem in Ann Arbor, and how new developments might address or make this issue different?
Sorry, I'll hog it, so please take. I mean, I'm passionate about affordability, but my personal opinion in Ann Arbor is, you know, the local community has such great intentions that they expect a uniform, and it doesn't exist. You know, as I stated earlier, the issue with affordability is that we have to deliver housing. Unfortunately, as I said, there's been a lot of legislative changes here in Michigan, but some of our federal pieces, most especially looking at land use and planning, transportation, form-based code, don't always align with the underwriting requirements and affordability. Specifically, the mechanisms that are used to fund the projects that we need have specific requirements that the community doesn't, you know, often understand. So now taking those requirements and layering in, you know, looking at the decarbonization, looking at transportation, looking at all different initiatives, sometimes those mechanisms for financing don't play well in the sandbox together. So there's decisions that have to be made on what pieces can work so housing can be developed, how Ann Arbor can position itself to be competitive with other cities, who are working with strong collaborations in affordable housing and truly understanding what all these pieces need, so they can work together and be effective in delivering the type of livable community that everyone wants to see.
I'd like to add.
Yeah, I know, and I'm going to too, and then maybe you and I are gonna say some of the same stuff.
Yeah.
From an affordable standpoint, from the city standpoint, I struggle with, there's always some kind of rebranding of what constitutes affordable housing, since I've been doing this. I mean, affordable housing has to have a definition, and it has to be enforceable. I mean, what Jen does at the core of it with the 30% AMI supportive housing, there is not enough of that for the community. There's a huge shortage of it. What our ordinances focus on is 60% AMI or less, and we could spend hours talking about what those formulas are and whether they're right or fair market rent, but they're what's codified. There isn't enough of that in the community. Then there's a conversation about, well, we need workforce housing, and that constitutes affordable housing, or we need, it used to be called workforce, now everybody wants to call it missing middle, and it's this 80 to 120 stuff. And for us, when we talk about affordable housing, we talk about something at the 60% AMI or lower, and something we can regulate. Everything we approve as affordable, we do we do rent verification on those properties. So that when they change hands in the future, we know they're not changing hands to someone who doesn't fit within those income brackets. If you don't have a structure in place, you can approve, and Shannon's gonna hate me for saying this, you can approve all the 8121, but if there's not some type of regulatory structure in place to make sure that the second owner doesn't make 300% AMI, or the owner that's in it 2 years after they buy it and it's been subsidized by a city, that they now make 300% AMI, and you don't have a mechanism to remove them from that house, you have then subsidized housing, usually, that you have no control over what those people who live there make as far as an income. So it may start for the first year or two as affordable housing, but then if you subsidize it and it all disappears and you have no mechanism to move those people out or change that, then it's really, it's been a subsidy to get the stuff built in a difficult market with no regulatory structure to make sure it stays in the affordable stock for years and years to come. And that's what I struggle with.
Can I just interrupt for just one quick second?
Yeah.
Sorry, I won't do this often, but sometimes in this space we use jargon. So the AMI is the area median income for our area, which is Ann Arbor, but it also includes Washtenaw County into that number. And so at 60% AMI for a person that's in a 3-person household, we're talking about $54,000. Just to sort of give you a baseline as you listen to Derek respond.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I'll turn it over to Jen. She knows volumes about this. I've learned more from her in the last few years than I do ever coming in. In my mind, affordable housing isn't affordable housing unless there's a regulatory structure to protect it going forward. It's just an offer that we can't verify going forward. We have no idea what a developer is going to charge on a unit unless we have the ability to do rent verifications. They have the ability to do income verifications going forward. So there's a lot of terminologies bantered about to get projects approved. As far as I'm concerned, unless we can do that, it's all market. You have some.
Can you guys hear me on this one? Okay. I'm gonna have to give a tiny answer, and then I'm gonna give a big answer. I don't care if a developer builds housing without affordable. I wish they would stop trying to build market rate housing with affordable, because they do not know, and it's not their mission, and they don't know how to serve those tenants. They screen people out instead of screening people in. And so if we want people to stay housed, I would rather see mission-based nonprofits. It doesn't have to be the Housing Commission. There's other mission-based nonprofits in the community. Avalon's probably the largest nonprofit. Those are the entities that should be doing the affordable housing. But I want to bring it up to a really high, a much higher level, which is all these discussions that we're having is about treating housing as a commodity. If we always treat housing as a commodity, we're never going to have enough affordable housing available to all of us who need it. We're going to always have folks that are spending more than half their income on their housing and transportation. So we have to think of it as a public infrastructure. And I'm not the first person to say this. There's others that are in this affordable housing arena that talk about this. That includes housing right now is driven by investors. Whether it's multifamily, large investors, individuals who have money, whether it's companies that are investing, or whether it's individuals like myself who own my home as an investment. Like, that is what's driving the problem in affordability. So we have to decommodify housing, and we also have to depoliticize it. So from a big picture, we need more public investment and public ownership, and there is no model like that in the United States. You have to go outside of the United States to other countries to see how housing is just part of what happens in the community as public ownership, where maybe 30 or 40% of the housing is built and owned by the public. They aren't making a profit. They're breaking even. They're reinvesting in that housing. They're keeping people housed. They don't have the financial pressures to cream who their tenants are. They don't have the financial pressures to give a return on the investment. And that is what drives all of the type of housing problems that we have in the United States right now. I could talk for a long time about that.
No, that's good. All right, let's do a couple rapid fires, especially so we can get you into the conversation right now. So what's one, if you could recommend one quick fix and maybe one major policy change to update or improve the opportunity for us to create more housing, what would that be?
So again, not being the housing expert, I'll deflect a little bit to a different subject, but I think it plays into it. One of the things that I think, having moved to Michigan 5 years ago, I see an over-reliance on millages and property tax. It's one of the only mechanisms that local jurisdictions can use to support the operations of the city. And all that burden gets placed on property owners, whether they're renters or whatever, they carry that cost. And in other communities I lived, they were able to diversify their portfolio. So last community in which I lived, they did a fuel tax indexing, where the gas tax was pegged to a rate of inflation. That rate of inflation, when it went up, then the gas tax went up, and they taxed both the local, state, and federal tax. All of that went to the local jurisdiction, which was then reinvested back in transportation. Another thing, in a community that has the number of visitors that we have, I think there's large opportunities to capture, higher hotel room tax, resort board room tax, that sort of thing, or sales tax or excise taxes and things like that. But unfortunately, within the state of Michigan, you don't really have a lot of those options. And I think it's, look at all the millages we passed. The one thing we're very fortunate about is Ann Arbor has been very supportive of things like the climate millage, like the sidewalk millage, the school millage, because we value those things. We want a better, quality of life. But there are ways to get some of that revenue to support those initiatives through other taxing structures or through other structures in general that unfortunately our hands are tied at the state level. And I think really looking at opportunities really could, I think, lessen some of the burden on property owners and therefore hopefully help with some of the affordability as well.
Yes.
So my true answer is whatever Jen Paul tells me is what we need to optimize, and I both mean that a little bit jokingly, but also very seriously. The part of this work is really leaning heavily into your experts, and Jen is an expert in this landscape, right? So I do look to Jen about what we need to do, and I would throw out, if I were to come up with something, and I'm going to look at her and see if this is a good idea. Rent stabilization?
Don't like it.
We don't like it. We don't like it. So that is not my idea. That is not mine. Great, excellent. So whatever Jen tells me. And then I think one of the things, again, leaning into what I know and staying away from what I don't, we have to find ways of lowering operating costs in buildings. Once we build them and operate them so people can live in them safely in a health way, we're not jeopardizing the safety of vulnerable populations by exposing them to toxic fossil gas. What are we doing in those spaces? So how do we design our buildings from the get-go so that they're leaning heavily into renewables and they're stacking solutions? Because if we just do electrification and we don't do energy efficiency, well, we're not winning, folks, right? So we've got to find a way, and this is a lot of what we spend our time in OSI looking at, is how do we stack these solutions and help people make the right choice at the beginning, because it's way, way more expensive to come in later and try to fix the problem. Stop. If we're in a flood, you turn off the faucet first. So how do we do that? And that's where I'm going in.
I would say a local housing trust fund. Some of these initiatives that we talk about, there's opportunities to leverage. There's a lot of philanthropic dollars. There's a lot of employment dollars. There's a lot of institutions that are looking to invest in housing that create impact. There's opportunities to be really creative with using market rate funds, using pensions, using, all types of mechanisms to fund affordable housing.
Quick fix.
Just quick fix. So, one quick fix and one major policy change to improve the opportunity to create more housing.
There is no quick fix, right? I mean, that's always the desire. We've gotten into this problem over generations of bad decisions when it comes to land use. Incorporate that with racism and everything else that has gone into the decisions that have impacted land use. This is been a problem that's been around for long since before I got involved in it. And unfortunately, I'm learning more about it every day, and I've been doing it for 20 years. My biggest concern, and the thing I see over and over again at local communities and the different ones I've worked at, is this idea that we're going to take this much money and spend it over this many problems. And all that does is keep us going backwards less fast, as opposed to fixing anything. I can't sit here and quote numbers to you, but I know there is limited funding. I know the greatest need right now, there is need across the spectrum for housing. But when we talk about subsidizing housing, when we talk about using city funds for housing or different funding capital stacks, in my mind, the greatest need is still at 30 and 60% AMI. I wish we had money to subsidize and do other projects and bring those in. My goal and the quickest fix for me is to take the greatest amount of funds available and point it to those who have the need the most, and that the housing that the private sector has the least ability to build. It doesn't mean people are struggling with 8120 right now. It doesn't mean those projects are struggling for all the reasons we've talked about. But if we keep taking a limited pot of money and spreading it thinner and thinner, we just go backwards less fast instead of fixing it. So I don't know if that actually fits within the question, but I don't have a quick fix for any of this. And anybody who says they do is crazy, right? I mean, this is, well, maybe John. But I mean, this is a long-term problem. I mean, we're going to be working on this for a long time. We can rezone hundreds of parcels. We can do a lot of different things. The development is going to come when the financing works and the people who own the parcels bring it to us because their existing developments don't have enough value to continue. Then they will come, then they will bring things in conformance with ordinance. But just rezoning things, just taking city action doesn't force change. It only allows the change to take place or facilitate it when those private owners decide to bring those projects forward. So, and that's difficult.
The one thing the city did that was somewhat of a quick fix was that city council got behind the idea of redeveloping underutilized city-owned parcels. Huge impact if we keep our commitment to actually develop those with affordable housing and not fall to pressures to sell them for market rate prices so that the city can use the revenues for some other city purpose, which, there's lots of things the city wants to accomplish. So if we can actually stay committed to that, like that's a huge, like I can't emphasize enough how impactful it is to not have to compete with the private sector, which I cannot do. I cannot quickly compete with a private developer to get the cash to buy a property. It gives lots of time to secure multiple resources that are needed when you do affordable housing. Our Catherine Street project, we have 12 resources right now, 12 different funding sources I had to apply for. Secured 9, waiting on 3, and that's with millage funds. Like the millage funds are just gap financing. It's not going to fund the entire project. But the other thing is the city's looking at right now, which could be very impactful, is bond financing for the development of affordable housing, because the interest rates out there right now, both on the construction and on like more permanent debt on our properties, are in the 8%, where the city could sell bonds for, I have no idea, 3.5%. So the amount of interest you're paying between the difference between those two is hugely significant.
All right. Next question. How can we address the disconnect between Ann Arbor Right's stated values, sustainability, diversity, inclusiveness, and their policy preferences? No new housing, streets are for cars. If there's a sidewalk on one side of the street, you don't need a sidewalk on the other. And what strategies do you think can help move the city from community engagement stalemate towards actual action?
I I think we do try, like, I work with other departments and we do try to work together on these issues, but I don't think it manifests necessarily in a all-in action and focus on housing in like a transportation plan or in like a sustainability plan. It's a piece of it, but we're not like integrated. And it's very hard to do because it takes a lot of hours. It takes a lot of work to put those together. But we do have to, I think, because I'm a housing person, that we have to put housing first, because not having housing, I mean, I'm assuming all of us are housed. Not having housing is so fundamentally critical to human health and having a successful community. I don't know how we can't put that as a high priority.
So I really like this question, and I've spent some time thinking about it from a meta standpoint, that we don't spend a lot of time together anymore, and we saw sort of this difference in the pandemic, that it's really easy to get on Nextdoor and snip, and it's really easy to like stay in your own sort of circle, and I think one of the things we have to do is sit in a room together and talk to someone who needs that sidewalk, and talk to someone who needs to be housed, and talk to someone, like your neighbor, to actually build that relationship, because when we're by ourselves, we see our own world. And I do this all the time, right? I see my worldview because that's what I know, and that's what's reinforced in my circles. And I think we have to be better at not just holding big public meetings, but actually going out and creating space for neighbors to talk to neighbors and understand, like, I want my child to bike to school, and I don't feel safe having her bike on certain lanes right now. And so those bike lanes that you don't like, or the slow builds, or the quick builds, they're not slow builds, my bad, wrong word. It took a while, it didn't take longer than intended. That maybe make it so you can't cut that corner. You know, that you may really dislike that, and I love that, because now she's safe. And if you see that and hear that, maybe it won't change your mind, but maybe it'll take an edge off of the way you've been thinking about it, so you think about the humanity in the decisions that we're making, because they're not bureaucratic decisions by themselves. We all have families, we all live here, we're all trying to listen to people's concerns. So humanize it is what I think about.
I'm just going to add real quick. I'll stick with the sidewalk example on one side of the street versus the other. Everybody agrees we should build more sidewalks. Everybody agrees we should protect trees. When you do something at a planning level and you write an ordinance, it's easy to write an ordinance that says both of those things are priorities. It's the trade-offs when you go to build something. If that sidewalk removes 19 mature trees, then that argues that those trees filter so much carbon, and that violates the 820 plan. And then our other plan, which is our non-motorized plan, says we should make as many non-motorized connections as we can. Both of those are true, and both of those the neighbors agree with 100%. But it's when you evaluate the trade-off of those at a neighborhood level that things get difficult. And that is just a microcosm of that conversation. It happens all the time. Every one of these plans is 100% accurate in its intent to do the 100th percentile good for all of these things, whether it's non-motorized, whether it's 820, whether it's affordable housing, whether it's land use. The codification of the ordinances that evaluate those trade-offs and say, this is what you shall, this is our invitation to you development communities to build here, should be and has to do its best job to evaluate those trade-offs, so that when the project's going to ground, there's an expectation of what the city wants and how to make those trade-offs. It's not easy, and no matter what you do, I've never seen a perfect ordinance and plan combination that says, oh yes, in this instance, we understand how to make these trade-offs. So we understand we're not going to get everything out of this project, and we know exactly how to make these trade-offs, and then therefore we're going to approve it, and everybody's happy. Those are where people have to understand that if you defend the 100% of each plan, it's unreasonable. That those are valid trade-offs to consider, and they're both right answers. And people end up at each other's throats over what are things that are two excellent answers: protect the trees or an additional sidewalk, and they're not always both possible. Love this.
Yeah, I think Derek kind of stole my thunder. The trade-off thing is really something. We relitigate every project, every sidewalk, every bike lane, every buffer, everything, and it's very time-consuming. It's very resource-intensive, and quite frankly, it slows down the progress. So, again, we have this policy statement that, we shall do this thing, and so we put forward a plan, we go out and engage with the neighbors, and we say, hey, here's the concept, and it's like, yeah, but I don't want it in front of my house. it's going to take away my parking, or, you know, the way people feel about on-street parking is pretty amazing. It's something we grapple with on a regular basis. And I think even Derek's example of, you know, trees, it's funny how many people try to pit Missy and I against one another, even though like Missy and I are in lockstep. But, you know, so many times a project will come in and, oh, well, you're causing me to idle longer at the light because you put in a bike lane. And it's like, well, if you're that concerned about emissions coming out of your vehicle, maybe try the bike lane on a bike lane, you know, like, if that's your primary concern. But, you know, I mean, I get that comment almost daily, because we also operate the signals in town, and so it's like, oh, the red light's too long. Well, a lot of people don't understand how a whole network of system works, and so you're just trying to explain all that and what those trade-offs are. And so we try to make the best decision based on all the factors, the public input, just the network approach, you know, the policy guidance that we have. But it's kind of a zero-sum game, unfortunately, in certain instances. So that trade-off will require, you know, giving up this thing in favor of this thing. And you know, we've even been criticized for compromise solutions as of late. Well, we heard from all these things, and we think this is the middle of the road option. And people say, well, you shouldn't take the middle of the road option, and you should, you know, push harder. And okay, well, we'll try that next time and see how well that goes. So it's just it's a constantly evolving conversation. And yeah, if I can figure this out, then that would make my job a lot easier.
Make a brand club.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and keep in mind,
Make a brand.
let's talk a little bit about transportation. So how is safety measured by the city as it relates to transportation, like 4 and 5 lane roads? Like how should we think about these 64-foot to like 80-foot sort of pavement islands in our community?
Yeah, so when it comes to safety, we monitor crash data pretty regularly. As a matter of fact, we just uploaded, if you go to the city's website and type in crash reporting, there's a map that you can go and look at all the hotspots of crash densities within the community. You can also look at all of the individual points to see, you know, was a bicyclist involved, pedestrian involved, was it a fatality, so forth and so on. So we monitor that data regularly and closely. And it does help inform our decisions. So the city has a capital improvement program that guides all the public investment within the city. One of the criteria by which all those projects are evaluated against is, does it include a safety enhancement as part of that project? And if it does, then it gets extra points, and therefore it moves up on the prioritization schedule. Now that's one point of many, right? There are many other factors that go into that, but it is something we've tried to institutionalize. Also, you know, bike ped infrastructure. Does the project, is it going to include enhancements to non-motorized travel? So again, all of those get factored in. Talking about kind of the large arterials that we have in the community, they are definitely problematic for us. You know, the data shows that higher speed roadways obviously lead to more serious crashes and fatalities than lower speed roadways. One of the things that we're working on right now is a speed management program for major roadways. The idea is to take traffic calming concepts that you might find in a neighborhood and actually apply them to major roads. There's also been efforts to road diet. I know there's some calls for us to do more road dieting, and maybe we've had some missed opportunities as of late. But our team has also, you know, like the one on Main Street in front of the big house. You know, we're doing one on Earhart currently. So there are opportunities when we've had an opportunity to do the analysis and determine that we can make those accommodations. We do pursue those. I think, you know, in terms of the number of roads, we also experience a problem with our smaller arterials as well, the 1 lane in each direction. So, you know, your Dexter, your Miller, your 7th Street. You know, we have like residential arterials, which are kind of unique, right? So these are people who live on those arterials. Their driveways come out onto those arterials. Their kids play in the front yard of those arterials, but they still feel unsafe, even though they might be lower volume, they might be lower speed, but they still create some challenges. And we're always trying to kind of iterate and make improvements to those corridors with crossing treatments, looking at, you know, the best practice from other communities to see what we can do to incorporate that. And so yeah, we're looking at those major roadways, and keep an eye out for the speed management program, because it's going to be big, it's going to be impactful. We suspect it's going to be met with some resistance, because once you start putting speed bumps on an arterial, I think some people are going to lose their mind. So what we can use are voices of positivity to help encourage a lot of that work. So.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Let me get one more question for the whole group, and then we'll create a little space for Q&A from the audience. So this can be a little loaded, but we'll see how this lands for you. So how can Ann Arbor ensure its accessibility and affordability access for all residents while still achieving our goals for clean air, sustainable energy, without inadvertently turning Ann Arbor into a community where only the wealthy can afford to live here? And I ask that question really as a resident too, because I want to do my part with sustainability, and we are looking at switching from gas-powered as well as forced air and doing, surface air heat pumps. But those quotes that are coming in just to install 2 in our home, they're approaching $10,000. So those are major capital investments for individual homeowners to move to that. And it's out of range for a lot of folks, unless you are sitting at the $150,000 of household income within the city. So how do we balance the goals that we have and not just by de facto make our community an exclusive enclave for the wealthy?
Work together. Missy and I work together all the time, but it takes money. It takes investment. And you can't do it without that. But I do want to say that when people spend most of their income on their housing, they don't have income to spend on local businesses. So we're also investing in our community and helping our tax base by having lower cost housing so that people can support our local businesses, which helps our tax base. Instead of thinking about our tax base as a municipality, we make more money by having higher taxes on fewer households.
I have 2 thoughts. One, I just want to reiterate what Jen led with, which is working together. And so we do actually work quite a lot to figure these questions out. But I also want to say this is not simple, right? If this was a simple response, we would have done it. And so we are having to stack solutions. We are having to think very differently about our systems and how we come at this problem. From your specific example, it is, we don't yet have the Inflation Reduction Act dollars flowing through the state to help incentivize these things, but they will. And when they come, how do we make sure that low-income households have access to those first? And we have rebate dollars from our local community climate action village going in. So how do we get those into low-income households so that the people who are making the transition and are getting the most support possible with that transition are low-income households and traditionally communities of color, because they do correlate really highly. And how are we doing bulk buys to make sure we're leveraging the city's buying power to drive down those costs even further? How are we doing engagement in an effective and efficient way? All of these things are complicated, but I will say these are things that we are doing. These are things that we are putting in motion right now because we see that problem, and we don't think the solution is one thing. This is the true definition of a wicked problem, where you can pull on one thread and it is going to spin out, right? So we're working to train contractors because we don't even have enough people in the labor market to do this work. So we're having to do that. We're having to provide incentives. We're having to work with manufacturers to bring more product. We're having to work with the contractors to even have it on the truck when your furnace goes so you can get a full climate air source heat pump. It's not simple, but that does not mean we are not working on it and working really hard on it. It's just going to require all of us kind of pushing the market forces to get where we need to go.
And I'll push back on the question a little bit because I think there's a little bit of a false choice there. While there are definitely some front-end costs that are hard to bear, I think a lot of sustainability, as is baked into the word, is focused on long-term, right? And so, yes, solar panels are very expensive, but over the life of that investment, they will pay for themselves, right? And so the idea is really that I think we need to change a lot of the conversation to the sort of next day, next week, next year, and look over the longer term. And I know that's hard, but a lot of these investments really are focused on that. I mean, whether it's the transportation investments, whether it's the sustainability investments, a lot of it is really just trying to, help with some of these costs in the long term and also achieve that sustainable future that we've identified as a community. So I think, we hear that a lot, that this stuff is expensive, and it is something that needs to be solved for on the front end, but it also, in theory, pays dividends, for generations to come.
I'll take it a step even further. I mean, it really is intense collaboration. When you start to look at the Inflation Reduction Act, it's still really funneling through, meaning there's high-level objectives funneling through federally. And from a statewide level, they're funneling through public policy and associates. Right now, those focus on coastal communities. It's on obviously higher level, very large scale decarbonization and other efforts. So I think it takes a collaboration to funnel those dollars into housing. We've really been involved in early communication with Michigan Saves and other institutions in Michigan to say, really, we need to make sure that that's translated and moving into housing for green initiatives. And how is that working with other energy type of programs that are investing in housing? So that's really critical. Obviously, there's new initiatives out of the White House and the green building footprint as well. Those are programs too that, once again, they're not simple programs that you can apply for grant dollars. You really have to be creative in how you use those in capital stack and start to think about other opportunities. I think from a higher level, we've been working a lot with the Michigan State Housing Development Authority on creating mechanisms and kind of looking at larger scale developers and some of the large home builders who all participate in buying programs where they can leverage obviously subcontractors, trades, and materials for housing, where we can collaborate as a whole to really look at cost savings. We need to get creative in looking at those type of structures. Remember, in Michigan, we've got Whirlpool, we've got DuPont, we've got Dow, we've got local institutions that right now our housing organizations can come together much like the home builders do on the public side and leverage type of costs. So I think we really need to rethink what housing means and how creative we can be to pair all these type of mechanisms so it benefits our local communities.
Cool. All right.
One more thing.
No, hold on there.
All right, Connor.
I want to get space for a couple audience questions, and then you know what you want to say. So we'll start over.
I'll smash it in.
It's okay. We'll start here in the half. Yes.
One of the things y'all talked about was alternate taxing structures, and I was going to see if y'all had any thoughts on a vacancy tax, something that I think has been piloted in a few cities across the U.S. for a few years now. Results, I think, were promising. And on that same note of vacant properties, how do y'all feel about repurposing vacant properties, office space, for instance?
When you're saying vacancy tax on unused vacant land, is that what you mean is what they're taxing?
As in, someone from the city or county would come out and assess whether a building is being used or how much it's being used, and if it stays unused or underused for a significant period of time, I think when they tried it in San Francisco it was a year is what they said, then there's a tax that is levied on it after a year.
None of us work in admin or in finance, so I don't know if the city's considering that or not, but it does seem like that's something you could only really do in a market like ours and not a market that's been de-invested in, that has a lot of, needs investment. But the idea of converting like commercial space or office space into housing, I'm not an architect, Lisa might be able to answer this, but I've talked to architects, Lisa, they're here. It has to meet code. And so only certain types of buildings really work well. And it seems like actually like older buildings that are smaller footprint and not these large, big office spaces are the ones that seem to work well as ones you can convert.
Yeah, I would add, and I don't know too much about the vacancy tax. When you start to, what I do know about private owners and floor space is as long as you're sure they're not going to add that cost on to the next tenant. Because when we add a cost through a regulatory structure or a tax, landlords are going to make their margins, and we don't have any control over that. If we get punitive with them, they will seek out a higher paying tenant, which then everybody will say, well, why don't we have any more mom and pop shops? And if we tax them, my fear is, and I don't know this, but my fear is when we do this without knowing, is that cost gets added on. It's rarely the building owner who pays that price. It's rarely the landlord that pays that price. It is usually passed off in some way, shape, or form. Yeah, well, I mean, but the next tenant that comes in, he's going to seek a higher rent if he's had to absorb that tax. He's going to be less likely or he or she are going to be less likely to rent at a lower level if they tack that onto their cost. I don't know that to be true, but that would be my fear without much more information.
Thank you.
Gentleman in the blue? Yeah.
So going back to one of the questions about early, like quick fixes or, some of you had brought up issues like single family zoning, and I think the frustration for me, I've seen a lot of change in our city council and the political structure in Ann Arbor. But what is stopping us from some things like a quick, let's eliminate single family zoning across the city? What's actually, are there barriers to doing that and being a quick fix? Like, I think I've seen out of Lansing, we elected a Democratic trifecta and we've made incredible policy changes in the past year. And so why can't we do a similar thing here in Ann Arbor?
Yeah, no, I mean, I can talk about it. Our master plan right now, our comprehensive plan, says a lot of things. And the council has acted on those, the initiation and the proactive rezoning of TC1 parcels and everything else. They have also adopted the policy that the single-family zoning district should be reevaluated. I have never seen a council direct a staff to skip over the should we question as part of the land use question and move directly to the how as part of the comprehensive planning process. It was unusual and extraordinarily aggressive, but I think the value in that is without a community conversation across the board as to how to do that, I don't think there's the basis in the comp plan to make that, and then again, I'll push back on quick fix. There is no such thing as a quick fix in my mind. We can change the comp plan, we can change the ordinance. It is going to still take an extraordinary confluence of events to get people to make those changes. Even with the eliminations of all of or most of the restrictions and cost restrictions to ADUs, it is not a quick fix. It still takes time. Construction costs still matter. There are still issues with that. When it comes to the evaluation and changing the zoning of a significant portion of your land, I don't know if you do it just and quickly change the ordinance. Council can. I am supportive that our comp plan says and gives the backbone to do almost anything our council wants to do. It says a lot. It also says a lot to give people an argument that you shouldn't do that. That is part of the problem with our comp plan right now, is it says a lot of things that can be used to argue. I do believe to make that type of change to single-family zoning, you do need some basis specifically within your comp plan for your elected officials to codify those ordinances.
Up front here.
So I heard a few conversations about different groups of people needing affordable housing, right? Those who need supportive housing, those falling in the AMI range that we talked about. How does the panel see the need for affordable housing coming into that conversation?
Can you repeat that last part?
Affordable
Student housing.
University of Michigan.
Students in Washington County, right? There's Eastern, there's U of M, there's WCC, there are people doing online learning, student housing.
Yeah, they need to, and they're starting to, they need to start providing the housing for their students. If they're gonna increase the number of students they're accepting, then they need to also figure out the housing piece of it. That's the single biggest driver, frankly, on the housing cost, not just in Ann Arbor, but now it's impacting other communities outside of Ann Arbor. 10 years ago, I never heard a student tell me they were living out in Ipsy Township because that was the only place they could afford. I hear that often now. And it's impacting even our tenants that have vouchers, tenant-based vouchers, that they're being priced out of housing outside of Ann Arbor now because they're competing with students. So I say it goes back to the universities and the colleges that they need to address it.
Great. Well, just so that we can end on time, I want to pause here and stop. You can obviously mingle with staff and ask your direct question. But to the panelists, first of all, thank you so much for the hour. Thank you for your responses. There was a lot in what you responded to that I wanted to follow up with, but we didn't have enough time, so maybe Lisa can do house party part 2 and we can continue this conversation. But starting with Raymond and just working your way down, if you have any closing thoughts or statements that you want to share, just go ahead. If you don't, pass the mic.
Yeah, want to see this change is really important, right? I mean, it's so often that we hear from people who are against things, and so I'm seeing people show up at city council meetings more so now, I think, that are in favor of a lot of this change, whether it be transportation, whether it be housing, whether it be infill. So I think, just keep fighting the good fight, help, support the work that we're trying to do, and call us out if we're not doing enough, or we're not doing, because I think a lot of that helps kind of, move the conversation forward.
Plus, and the systems that got us into this are the systems that are going to get us out of it. So we're going to have to be willing on thinking really differently and being transformative in how we approach a systems problem. This is not an individual problem, it's systematic.
I would say be adaptable. We always have in our mind, that we're targeting specific income, but remember, producing housing relieves, the most vulnerable citizens. So I think right now we have to be cognizant of the different funding mechanisms that are out there. Taking a look, the state agencies have a lot of different funding. It may not always fit the buckets of what's in the master plan, but some of those can provide relief to other types of housing. So I think, people need to be adaptable, they need to be flexible. I think they need to be collaborative and working, with private developers, with nonprofits, with the housing commissions, with local employers. There's strength in numbers, and you see good examples with the city of Grand Rapids right now, with Traverse City, with the city of Detroit, of where they're really pushing numbers to meet those overall housing goals in terms of units that are produced.
I'm going to sneak my answer in from earlier. Okay. One is when we all do our jobs well, things get less affordable. I have never found an instance where a community that does not motorize well, that does mobility well, that does sustainability well, that does regulatory structure well, doesn't attract developers, and doesn't create a place where people want to live, that inevitably pushes on costs. I haven't seen it work anywhere else. I'm sure there's a lot of economics at play in there that could prove me wrong or less. I've never worked in a city that has done things well where they have been able to not then push costs higher. And that trade-off is difficult. The other thing I always like to leave people with is by the time a project is in front of the Planning Commission and City Council, it is usually too late for negotiation. Communities need to focus on their plans and their ordinances to deliver projects they want. If they're seeing projects they don't want, by that point, if they're technically compliant with the code, 90% of what a planning department does is not recommend whether a planning commission or city council should or shouldn't approve something. They're recommending whether it's technically compliant with the rules that are in place. If you don't like the rules that are delivering the projects, focus on the ordinance. The plan sets the policy for it. It's really the ordinance that is the invitation to develop. I mean, when you have a zoning district, whether it's D1 or residential, that's an invitation to the development community to come in and provide a project that is technically compliant with those. Everybody gets caught up in the project part, and then when it is either approved and everybody's happy or angry, they go away, and nobody looks at what is the invitation to the development community and fixing it. I think that is really, really super important. That is when you get to a project phase, it is usually too late. Developers are willing to build what a community wants as long as it's clear up front. They know what they're getting into. They can adjust land value based on the regulatory structure. They want to see you codify things, even if they are going to be difficult, that they're going to be required to do. If you are going to require net zero buildings, codify it so they can adjust what they're willing to pay for the land and know what they need to do to build a building. If you don't require it and then it gets to the end of the project and you push back and say, don't approve it because it doesn't have affordability or it doesn't have solar panels or it doesn't have these things, by then there's so much investment, time, and effort put into it, the pliability of those projects is almost nil. So I would just encourage everybody as you're looking at this, if you're not happy with what the zoning ordinance delivers or the projects coming forward, it's not the fault of the Planning Commission or City Council for approving them. It's the necessity to address the codification so that by the time they get there, they represent what the community wants. And it really shouldn't be I mean, there should be some trade-offs evaluated at that time, but it should be a much easier process.
I'm going to say old model, hyper-local. These people get to decide what happens on this little property. When the city council asked us to looking at publicly owned properties, we did a community-wide engagement process. We went even outside of the city where people who couldn't live in the city were part of that participation. That gives political cover, frankly, to the people who have to vote on these issues when you make it more than just this block in the 1,000 feet around it. Like, we have to change the way we do our community engagement and input into the conversation.
All right, well, thank you all.